Federal Reserve Board in San Francisco is supposed to regulate Silicon Valley Bank because it's in its region, okay? Do you wanna know who was on the board of the San Francisco Federal Reserve? Greg Becker, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank.
It's amazing, it's amazing.
So he chose not to regulate himself.
Interesting.
Of course, right? But like when progressives point out, hey, these bankers regulate themselves through the Federal Reserve. No one got elected. This is absurd. And forget that no one got elected. These are literally the banks on the boards, including the major banks in New York are on the board of the Federal Reserve overall in New York, the most important one, right? It's absurd that they would regulate it. Of course they allow for maximum risk to make maximum profit in the short term, and if it blows up later, that's your goddamn problem, not their problem. They already took the money home.
I hate this idea that it's somehow compassionate to have the kind of view that Bernie Sanders has. It's just a fact that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty, market-based systems than any other system in the history of the world. So the capitalist view actually is the compassionate one.
Look, the next time there's a conversation about regulation and deregulation, come back to the Young Turks. We'll show you. Everybody will tell you, oh no, there won't be any problems at all when we deregulate. And after it blows up, they'll go, oh, nobody could have seen this coming. But actually this one was everybody could have seen coming because it was the exception. It's never the exception, it's definitely the rule. All these folks that are in giant corporate interests are lying to you. That's just the reality of it.
This whole tranche of banks has been under-regulated for 5 years now. And people are very concerned about when you lift the hood, what's under the hood, since the regulators clearly have not been on top of their job.
You lift the hood and you find a jalopy, and that's what Senator Elizabeth Warren is concerned about. While she was speaking at on CBS News, Face the Nation, of course, she brought up the specific issues in regard to deregulation of mid-sized banks, while also talking about the lack of regulation and oversight coming from the Federal Reserve. In fact, in a new piece in the New York Times, there is some evidence that the Federal Reserve knew that Silicon Valley Bank in particular was in trouble for over a year before its collapse, but did very little about it. Now, in 2021, a Fed review of the growing bank found serious weaknesses in how it was handling key risks. Supervisors at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, which oversaw Silicon Valley Bank, issued 6 citations. Those warnings, known as matters requiring attention and matters requiring immediate attention, flagged that the firm was doing a bad job of ensuring that it would have enough easy to tap cash on hand in the event of trouble. Now, in the lead up to the 2018 deregulation of mid-sized banks, the argument was that, we don't need government oversight. We can just rely on the Fed to do the oversight. But at the time, Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, made it clear that he actually had no interest in regulation or oversight. In fact, wanted to pull back on regulation and oversight. So Congress did the deregulation knowing full well that there would be no cops on the beat when it came to mismanagement of funds at mid-sized banks like Silicon Valley Bank. And the bank, of course, didn't fix its vulnerabilities even after being notified by the Federal Reserve. I mean, they essentially got a few letters and they're like, yeah, whatever. By July of 2022, Silicon Valley Bank was in full supervisory review, getting a more careful look, and was ultimately rated deficient for governance and controls. It was placed under a set of restrictions that prevented it from growing through acquisition. So whoa, you're not allowed to merge with another bank. Very naughty, you've been very, very bad, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so look guys, let's this time tell you how the game's actually played. So when they're deregulating, everybody says, oh no, everything's gonna be fine. So you remember they deregulated banks under $250 billion. Again, the Silicon Valley Bank is in that group, and they said everything's gonna be totally fine, everything's going, no exceptions, no nothing, everything's fine. Then when something inevitably blows up, and like the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, us, it's Nomi Prince, et cetera, we're right all along. The deregulation was a disaster and it led to a collapse, right? They then turn around and go, well, I mean, everybody saw this coming. And they look at the regulators, they had all these warnings and stuff. And so, well, then you think, wait a minute. First you said nobody can see it coming. Then you say that everybody can see it coming. So what's the game that's being played here? The game is when you do an article like this at the New York Times after the collapse, you're trying to show that it's an exception to the rule. Oh, it turns out with Silicon Valley Bank, not the other banks, not deregulation, but at Silicon Valley Bank, they had a bunch of notices and the Federal Reserve was about to work on it. But hey, look, let's hold them accountable. They didn't act quickly enough, etc. No, it's not an exception. Deregulation screws things up almost every time for these colossal companies.
Now, just to buttress Cenk's point, in fact, reinforce his point, why don't we go to the conversation that Senator Warren had with Margaret Brennan over at Face the Nation? Because that conversation was incredible, it really was. How dismissive she was, and I'm talking about the host here, of the impact that deregulation had on the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. So let's take a look at one portion of that conversation right now.
The reason that I'm calling right now for changes in the Fed in its regulatory approach and changes in Congress so that we roll back the authorization to lighten those regulations.
Well, I know there's some dispute on the regulation. You're talking about a tweak in 2018 to Dodd-Frank, and I know Barney Frank, one of the authors of that original regulation, is a dispute with you in regard to what actually happened here. But I want to talk about the now.
I wouldn't call it a tweak.
Well, Senator, though, I want to ask you about what Congress can do now, because it would be up to Congress to lift the FDIC insurance levels for those deposits above $250,000.
Now get a load of that deflection, right? So Elizabeth Warren's there to talk about the impact that the 2018 deregulation had and how she wants to reverse that in the very least. Margaret Brennan, of course, brings up Barney Frank, who was one of the original architects of the incredibly weak sauce Dodd-Frank regulations following the 2008 collapse. What Brennan failed to mention is what Barney Frank has been up to since his career in Congress ended. What is he doing now, Cenk? Oh, that's right, he's a lobbyist who works on behalf of the banking sector. Weird.
Oh my God, that is such
weird. Weird that you wouldn't mention that, Margaret Brennan.
No, it's not just that, guys. Now that's two interviews in a row I've seen of Margaret Brennan, one with Bernie Sanders, one with Elizabeth Warren, where she was so dismissive of the guests. So I haven't watched all of her interviews, so fair is fair, but I'm gonna keep an eye on it, because my guess is, and we'll see if it's true or not, when corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans are on there, she's going to be incredibly genteel and polite, right? But Warren comes in here and goes, hey, maybe we should regulate the banks. She's like, whoa. She cut her off like 12 times in 6 minutes. It was incredible to watch. And she's so dismissive with progressives. She has this, like, the classic mainstream media sneer, like, oh, you guys want regulation. There's a tweak of a regulation, no big deal. Hey, focus now, okay? What are we doing now? And it's like, she wasn't driving towards how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again. She's just like chasing the news of the day with like, hey, what further tweaks are we gonna make? There's never a conversation in mainstream media about, hey, are we doing this all wrong? Is it right to have the bankers sit on the board of the institution that's supposed to regulate them? Isn't that insane, right? Because you cannot ask those questions on CBS. If you ask that question, you're gonna be in a world of trouble. All these corporate interests protect their own, and it's kind of disgusting to watch. Anyways, look, guys, bottom line is, they will blame everyone in Silicon Valley Bank. They will pretend it's exception, and they won't fix a goddamn thing. That's my opinion. Go ahead.
They're not gonna fix anything, so let's just be clear about that. So anyone who is nervous about where their money is, I mean, look, if you're under the FDIC insured limit of $250,000, you're gonna be fine. That money is guaranteed by the federal government. Anything above that, you're playing with fire, considering, I mean, this is gonna keep happening. If we're gonna keep these mid-sized banks deregulated, and if there's no cop on the beat checking to make sure, and not just checking to make sure that there isn't mismanagement, but actually enforcing actionable items to ensure that they right their wrongs, this is gonna keep happening, right? Which is why Margaret Brennan's focus in that interview wasn't on the regulations. It was on, should the FDIC increase the cap for depositors? Should they increase the cap? How much should they increase the cap by? How about we fix the system so it doesn't get to a point where the FDIC has to come in and make all these depositors whole because of mismanagement and risks taken by the banks? How about that?